All righty. Good morning again, everybody. I'm Paul DeFonzo out of West Seattle, formerly of Brooklyn. A little bit about me before I start the PowerPoint. Like many of you, I suppose, I've been a baseball nerd for most of my life. Started out as a Yankee fan, which really got me interested in history. I mean, not to disparage other teams, but the Yankees had Ruth and Gehrig and DiMaggio and all those guys, and it really got me interested in Yankee history and baseball history. And I started collecting baseball cards at a very young age, which got me interested in statistics and batting averages and middle names of ball players. And, you know, there was really just no end to it. So I reached a point in my life where I started to consider myself really, you know, quite the baseball expert. And then sometime in the 80s, I got my first baseball encyclopedia, and boy, was that an eye-opener, because I realized how much I really didn't know, especially about the 19th century. There were 19th century Hall of Famers. There were 19th century World Series, which I knew nothing about. And it was really a very humbling experience to realize how much I actually didn't know. So probably sometime in the 1980s, this project began to gestate in my mind, not only to inform myself about what I didn't know anything about, but also I kind of felt like I was on a mission from God, that it was my responsibility to somehow bring these stars and this history from the 19th century and going forward to the masses. I mean, people should know more about baseball history than Ruth, Gehrig, Cobb, and Cy Young. And in fact, probably nobody knows anything about Cy Young other than that he's got this award. So anyway, all that being said, we have this wonderful book, Big League Baseball History, Volume 1. I am working on Volume 2, 1871 to 1893, The Road to 60 Feet 6 Inches. 1893 being the year that the 60 feet 6 inches distance for the pitching mound was established, which we still have for the present day. Okay, just about any discussion of the beginnings of organized big league baseball has to start with Harry Wright and his team of professionals from the Cincinnati Red Stockings of 1869. Harry Wright's team was not the first all-professional team. He was involved in signing many of the players on the team. He ran the team on the field. He played center field. He played relief pitcher. He organized all the traveling and counted the money. And he was really the first baseball manager in a modern sense. He took on all comers. His team played from coast to coast, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, beat everybody, 64-0. And really, his team formed the impetus for a national baseball league, which became known in 1871 as the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. Interestingly and ironically, the Cincinnati team was not an inaugural team in the National Association. The team disbanded after 1870, but Harry was signed by the Boston club to put together a team, which he did to great success, forming the first baseball dynasty, the Boston Red Stockings, from 1872 to 1878, winning 6 pennants in 8 seasons. Certainly the National Association would not have had any gravitas or legitimacy without Harry Wright having been involved in it, in view of the great fame and renown he accomplished in 1869 with his undefeated Cincinnati club. Harry has been enshrined in the Hall of Fame. However, unfortunately, he's generally forgotten today. I mean, outside of this room, I doubt any baseball fan has ever heard of him. And I did have some correspondence with the team historian for the Atlanta Braves, who advised me that he finally succeeded in getting Harry Wright enshrined in the Atlanta Braves Hall of Fame, the Boston Red Stockings being the ancestors of the present Braves team and the oldest continuously operating baseball franchise in America. So Harry Wright's Boston club ends up being the first baseball dynasty with 6 pennants in 8 seasons. Let's look at a couple of their players. Albert Goodwill Spaulding. If Harry Wright's story is the story of the beginnings of organized baseball in the 19th century, Al Spaulding's story is really the story of baseball going forward in the 19th century. He wore every hat imaginable in the baseball universe. He was Harry's star pitcher in Boston. He was a terrific athlete. He was generally the best hitter and the best fielder at his position every year. He went on to manage the Chicago club, became the owner of the Chicago club, became a sporting goods magnate, founding the Spaulding Sporting Goods Company with his brother, which still exists in the present day. And he became an ambassador for the game and is probably the guy most responsible for the National League becoming the preeminent league in baseball in the 19th century. Al, like Harry, is in the Hall of Fame, but again, he's generally forgotten today unless you're talking about his sporting goods business. His company used to make those little pink Spalding balls that perhaps we played with as a kid, and they're still around, but nobody knows anything about Al Spaulding, perhaps outside of this room, who is going to Mariner games. And I feel it's my duty to bring Al back into the popular consciousness amongst some of the other guys. Here's another player from Harry Wright's dynastic Boston club, Ross Barnes, who was a second baseman, is probably the best player from the early to the mid 1870s. He was an excellent fielder. He was a star hitter. He specialized in what was known as the fair foul hit, which was a ball that when you hit it, it starts in fair territory and then veers into foul territory before it reaches a base. Today, such a ball would be considered a foul ball, but at the time that Ross played, it was considered a fair ball, and nobody was better at it than him. Ross has been overlooked for the Hall of Fame, but he has been recognized as an overlooked 19th century star by the SABR 19th Century Committee. Now, the way I set up the book, every chapter is a year. So you go from year to year, and every chapter has illustrations like this one. These cards are actually baseball cards, which are produced by Jesse Loving out of Ars Longa Art Cards. What I wanted to do with this book, I wanted to blow the dust and cobwebs off the 19th century, which most people consider the 19th century is. If you look at books about the 19th century, they're full of old sepia photographs. I wanted to get rid of all that. I wanted to bring these guys back into the consciousness in living color, and have them considered as living persons. I mean, you look at this photograph. I mean, would you want to buy a horse and buggy from this guy? I mean, just look at the arrogance in his face. I mean, he knows he's the best player in baseball. And just don't get that aspect when you're looking at an old black and white photograph. One of the things I do in each chapter as well, I analyze the best players at each position, both offensively and defensively, for every year, for every league, so that even though they may not have pictures in the book, their names will ring again in the popular consciousness. At least that's the dream. In the appendices to the book, I have the formulas for how I arrive at the best offensive and defensive scores, and also the best pitchers. And if that interests you, you can look at it. I know people don't really want to read about statistics and formulas, but it's there if you want it. So, the road to 60 feet 6 inches, one of the running themes in the book are the pitching rules. So what were the pitching rules? From 1871 to 1878, we're working from a 45-foot pitching distance, no mound, no rubber. Guys are pitching from a 6-foot by 6-foot pitching box. So they're in the box, they're starting at the back line of the box, and they're allowed to do whatever they want in that box. They can get running starts, they can do pirouettes. Thing is, they're not allowed to go beyond the front line with their feet while delivering the ball. Of course, when they deliver the ball, their arm might be beyond the front line, but that was tolerated. So the ball is actually coming to the batter closer than 45 feet away. Pitching was underhanded, hit batsmen not awarded first base, foul balls were not counted as strikes, hitters were entitled to call for high or low pitches. If a pitch was delivered right over the plate, but the batter had requested a high pitch and turned out to be a low pitch, the umpire might end up calling it a ball. 3 balls were required for a walk. However, umpires were frequently subject to abuse, both physical and verbal. So there was an awkward etiquette for an umpire to actually call a ball or call a strike. It was more along the lines of, hey, maybe you should have swung at that one. If you don't swing at that one next time, I may call a strike. So in practice, you might get 8 or 9 bad ones before they actually call 3 balls for a walk. 3 strikes were required for a strikeout. A swinging strike was, of course, a strike, but a call strike was more problematic. Consequently, back in the early days, especially in the 1870s, you have far fewer strikeout and walk totals than we're used to in the present day. Now, pitchers are always looking for an edge. So although they're supposed to do their underhand fling, gradually what's happening? The arm angle is moving up. Okay, they're not supposed to do that, but they're doing it because pitchers want an edge. So they've got their ball, they're doing their little dance, they're doing their pirouette, and the arm angle is coming up. And when the arm angle comes up, it starts to become a sidearm fling. What do you get? You can break the wrist and you start to get a curveball. All right. So traditionally, the game had been a game of batters against fielders. The pitcher's job was really to just put the ball over with his underhand fling. When pitchers start throwing semi-sidearm and throwing curves, the game starts to evolve from batters against fielders to pitchers against batters. Moving on.
Question.
Yes.
How many umpires did they have in the game?
There was one umpire,
The home plate umpire.
home plate umpire, and it really took a long time for a second umpire to be considered part of the game. It happened in the next decade. Now, this is Larry Corcoran, who was a star pitcher for Chicago. Here he's in an Indianapolis uniform. And pitchers were starting to have such an advantage over hitters in the 1870s. In 1879, the pitcher's box was reduced by 6 feet by 6 feet to 6 feet by 4 feet wide. So can't quite do the same pirouettes that you were doing before. And they also recognized the reality of a base on balls and ruled that now 9 balls would be required for a walk. So we're actually taking that awkward etiquette and putting it in the rules. Now I picked this picture of Larry because he's standing in the pitcher's box. This is what the pitcher's box looked like. You can see the back half of it. So generally they would start at the back here by the line because you want to get that running start. You want to get that momentum when you fling that pitch. Now, I have some visual aids today. I was at the New York Historical Society some months ago, and they were selling 1870s balls. So we have a ball which purports to be a reproduction of an 1870s ball. It's what's called a lemon peel ball. And I have a Rob Manfred Major League ball, and I'll just pass these out, and you can make your own conclusions about what it was like to try to play with one of these balls for a whole game. Now, back in the 19th century, generally, they only used one ball for the game, okay? Balls were very expensive to make, and if a ball got hit out of play or into the stands, they'd stop play and they'd go get it because they didn't want to use a second ball, and frequently they didn't even have a second ball. So as you're as you're kind of kneading that ball in your hand as we move along, just think what it must have been like to use that single ball for a whole game, getting dirty, getting wet, getting muddy, getting soft, and how difficult it must have been to for a hitter to try to power that ball somewhere. Okay, moving on. The second great dynasty of the 19th century, the Chicago White Stockings of the 1880s. 4 pennants in 6 years. These are some of the principals from that team. The player manager, first baseman, the massive Cap Anson, who's in the Hall of Fame, and his starting outfielders, George Gore in center field, Mike King Kelly in right field, Abner Dalrymple in left field, first, second, and third in the league in runs scored in 1881. So the Chicago team was a real dynamo. And then the second dynastic team in the 19th century, the ancestors of today's Chicago Cubs. I was at the 19th century conference in Cooperstown a few weeks ago, and one of the presenters actually opined that Cap Anson should not even be in the Hall of Fame because of his views on blacks and their right to play in the game. Okay, offense isn't doing well in the 1870s going into the 1880s. So changes were made to the pitching rules. In 1881, the pitching box was moved 5 feet back. So now the front line of the pitching box is no longer 45 feet from home plate. It's now 50 feet from home plate. Still have a 6 foot by 4 foot pitching box. You can still get your running starts. You can still do your pirouettes. Reduce the number of balls necessary for a walk from 9 to 7, since they needed more guys on base. And now we're going from underhand to sidearm, which gives you the curveball, and those pitchers are always looking for an edge. And now we're starting to get into overhand pitching, which is not legal. It's sneaking in, and our poor beleaguered umpires, when they try to enforce illegal pitching, it sometimes doesn't work out so well for them. So pitching is evolving. So we're getting more and more into the confrontation between the pitcher and the hitter as we enter the early 1880s. 1884, pitching still rules. Old Hoss Radbourn in Providence, he's wearing a Boston tunic here, and Guy Hecker in Louisville and the American Association dominate their respective leagues. Radbourn winning 60 games in a season, which is still the record, and Guy Hecker doing nearly as well, but his Louisville team didn't finish in first place. Now, one of the things that happens in 1884, we have our first World Series. Yes, in the 19th century, we had World Series. The first World Series was not in 1903. It was in 1884 between Providence and the New York Giants. Radbourn's Providence team wins the pennant in the National League. They go to the World Series against New York, and Hoss Radbourn pitches all 3 games in a sweep. Even though they won the first 2 games, they still play the 3rd game anyway. So we actually win 63 games during the season if you count the postseason. Now, Guy Hecker is overlooked. We have a second league, as I mentioned, by 1884, which is the American Association, not to be confused with the American League. We don't get the American League until the turn of the century, but the American Association comes in 1882, and Guy Hecker's team doesn't win the pennant, so Guy Hecker doesn't get to shine in the postseason and is unfortunately, for most people, reduced to the dustbin of history. Old Hoss Radbourn is in the Hall of Fame. Guy Hecker is not. Talk about the dominance of pitching. If you look at the single season all-time pitching leaders, the top 7 are from 1884 and 1886. This is how dominant pitching had become over hitting in the mid-1880s. And a little bit of trivia, who's the number 8 guy on the all-time single season pitching list? Anybody know? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Who's not from this era?
Innings pitched or?
Strikeouts. Top 7 guys on the all-time single season strikeout list are from 1884 and 1886. Who's number 8?
Jesse Vance?
No, Nolan Ryan. Okay, moving on. And by the way, the top 7 are all from this era. The first 8 out of 10 are also from this era. That's how dominant pitching had become. Okay, the American Association. Yeah.
Because you indicated strikeouts in the 1870s because of the muddy ways in which balls and strikes were called.
Yeah.
Strikeouts were quite low.
Yeah.
When did the strikeout suddenly come such that the strikeout artists are?
As we get into the late 1870s and the early 1880s, when we start throwing sidearm with curveballs, we start throwing overhand, even though we're not supposed to. Hitters were at such a terrific disadvantage. Strikeouts soared. Now, I don't want to go back because I might mess up the PowerPoint, but on the front cover of the book, there are some baseball cards. The guy on the far right, Matt Kilroy, holds the record for single season strikeouts, which he established in 1886, 513, which is still, of course, the record. Second league comes in 1882, the American Association, and it gives us Big League Baseball's third dynastic team, the St. Louis Browns, the ancestors of today's St. Louis Cardinals. These are some of the principals from the Browns who win 4 pennants in the American Association. Owner Chris von der Aa, who was frequently ridiculed in the press because he spoke with a very heavy German accent, and he was very much an entrepreneur. When his ballpark was not being used for baseball, he would have carnivals going on, he would have horse races going on. He was really one of the very first baseball entrepreneurs, ridiculed at the time because people considered that he was some kind of weirdo, but today people look back on him with a lot more respect. Arlie Latham, who was a third baseman known for heckling both opposing batters and umpires, a master base stealer. Silver King, one of the pitching aces from those teams. Charlie Comiskey, who many of you know as later the owner of the White Sox, was actually the player manager and first baseman for the St. Louis Browns. Parisian Bob Carruthers, another one of their star pitchers. And all the way on the end, Kurt Welch, famous for his $15,000 slide to beat the White Stockings in the World Series in 1886. The Browns actually play 4 World Series, 2 of which were against the White Stockings, and they did have a tie and a win over Cap Anson's mighty White Stockings. I love this baseball card of Kurt Welch because the way Jesse made the card, the ball is actually coming into the card from outside the frame of the picture, which I think is just terrific. I just love Jesse's cards. You know, I sought out Jesse. I had been buying cards from Jesse. He used to sell them on eBay, but he stopped doing it. And when I decided I wanted to write the book and have illustrations, I just had to have his cards as illustrations. And I did track them down, and here they are. And he ended up not only making a deal with me to get the cards in the book, but he also made cards specially for the book, which have not been in circulation. Okay, offense is still plummeting. 1886, all these pitchers are setting single season strikeout records. So 1887, something of a watershed year for changes in pitching. The pitching box is reduced in size from 6x4 to actually from 4x7. It had already shrunk to 4x5.5. So 5.5 feet long by 4 feet wide. No more running starts. The pitcher's foot is now anchored at the back of the pitching box, and he's only allowed to take 1 step. And that looks a lot like the pitching that we have today. If you're at the back of the pitching box and you're only allowed to take one step, that's very similar to what we have today. Hit batsmen are now allowed to go to first base. 5 balls required for a walk. 1, 2, 3, 4 strikes required for a strikeout. That's how dominant pitching had become. In 1887, the pitcher had to record 4 strikes to get a strikeout. And the batter was no longer permitted to call for high or low pitches. It's also this year in which we get a strike zone, which is defined as being from the knees to the shoulders. So this was really a great leap forward in how pitching was to occur. And think of where we started back in 1871, underhand from 45 feet away with running starts and gyrations and the whole business.
Were both leagues adopting the rules at the same time?
Yes. Although there was some difference in how many balls they would have for a walk. I think the American Association continued to have a different number, and one league was ahead of the other in overhand pitching. Overhand pitching had now been legalized, although the American Association was still a year or two behind.
One question.
Yeah.
What hit batsman before 1887? What was that considered? Ball strike or what?
Well, it certainly wasn't a strike. It was, yeah. It was either going to be a ball or it was going to be a do-over, the way they would do things. Okay, moving on. Labor trouble. This is the 1880s. Baseball ownership was not much different from corporate ownership in the world at large. Players had no recourse if they had any kind of a grievance. So in the late 1880s, the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players is formed. It was not formed by John Ward, but John Ward eventually took over the organization, and together with Tim Keefe, both of whom were star players for the New York Giants, promulgated the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players, which essentially was a labor union. And it gave the players some voice in grievances against management for things like fines and penalties and labor disputes and whatnot. It got to the point where during a trip abroad organized by Al Spalding, of which Ward was a participant, the owners had a meeting in 1889 at which they imposed a salary structure. And of course, Ward wasn't there to comment on it. He became incensed. He returned from the trip, and behind the scenes, together with Keefe and other players, they formed a third league, the Players League. And they did this behind the backs of the NL and AA owners who had no clue what was going on. And suddenly in 1890, Ward announces we have this third league, which was filled with stars from the National League. They used a livelier ball. They had greater attendance than the NL and the American Association. But of course, they were blackballed from being in the World Series or anything like that. Al Spalding was very active in trying to keep the league under wraps. The league was essentially successful. They completed their season. They outdrew both the NL and the AA. They played a more exciting brand of ball because they had a livelier ball, and they had better players than the NL and AA because many of the star players jumped from the NL and the AA to the Players League. And but the thing is, though, everybody was losing money because suddenly you had all these teams that the public had to make a choice to patronize. So all 3 leagues were losing money. And during consolidation talks at the end of the season with the Players League and the other leagues, the NL moguls had a brainstorm, which is that, okay, we will talk to you Players League owners about possible amalgamation, but when we're in the room together, we don't want any Brotherhood guys in there, okay? These guys are not owners. We don't want them in there. It was a divide and conquer strategy, which worked. The Players League owners eventually were cowed because they were losing money. They sold out, and the Players League was done. And nobody knows anything about the Players League, okay? And that's not right. You know, this was something that was, you know, close to 100 years ahead of its time. You know, the players did not enjoy this kind of freedom in their salary negotiations and their profit sharing until free agency comes in the 1970s. But nobody knows a thing about it. And they made poor John Ward wait to be enshrined in the Hall of Fame until like 1963 or 1964 after he was dead, which is absurd because not only was he a player who transcended the game, who was bigger than the game, but he was also a fantastic ball player. Tim Keefe is also in the Hall of Fame and has the record for the lowest season ERA ever. Now, one of the things I do in the book, as I mentioned, for every season, I list the top offensive and defensive players by position with essentially a proprietary formula, which you can read about in the appendices. And I came upon this, I sort of formulated it in the 80s before we had WAR or WA or anything like that. And I have a lot of fun doing it. And you can see some household names here. Big Dan Brothers, best first baseman in the American. This is the 1891 season of the American Association. So we have Big Dan Brothers, who's with Boston. We have Hugh Duffy, who's also with Boston. Boston does win the pennant that year for the AA. For our Canadian friends, we have Tip O'Neill, who is the top left fielder from St. Louis. And fabulous Chicken Wolf, best right fielder out of Louisville. So I do this every year for each league. There's a little chart like this, which just shows you the best players offensively and defensively, and also the best starting pitcher and the best relief pitcher, if in fact we have statistics for relief pitching. There was not a lot of relief pitching going on in the 19th century. Okay, 1892, son of a gun. They don't do the 4 strikes anymore. We're back to 3 strikes. Offense is plummeting again. Not only that, attendance is down. Offense and attendance is down. So the owners decide this is not good. We have to do something. We have to generate more exciting games. We have to generate more offense. So for 1893, the pitching box is gone. We now have a pitching slab, which replaces the back line of the pitching box. And the back line, that pitching slab, is moved 5 feet back to 60 feet 6 inches, which is the present pitching distance which we have today. This happens in 1893. Notice we still don't have a mound. We have a pitching slab, but there's no mound. Pitchers are still pitching off a flat surface, but their foot has to be in contact with the pitching slab. So what happens? 1893, it's a whole new ball game. This 60-foot, 6-inch pitching distance was just dropped on the pitchers out of the blue, and they were pummeled. They were just shellacked. Cy Young is the best pitcher in baseball in 1893. He wins 33 games. And I got news for you. Most people don't know this. Cy Young was a control specialist, okay? And Cy Young in 1893, because of the new pitching distance, ends up walking more batters than he strikes out, okay? Every pitcher in the league who pitched an appreciable number of innings, say over 100 innings, walked more batters, excuse me, than he struck out. Love his sweater, by the way.
Yeah.
Big Ed Delahanty in Philadelphia ushers in this new orgy of offense with 146 runs batted in, a 368 batting average, and 19 home runs, which was a very high home run total for that time, considering the kind of ball that they were using, which is floating around somewhere. The offensive extravaganza continues throughout the 1890s as pitchers are adjusting to the new pitching distance. And you have teams with a team batting average of over 300. The Philadelphia club one year, had all three of its outfielders hit 400 or better. And that's how crazy it was in the 1890s for offense because of the 60-foot, 6-inch pitching distance. Yet we have a dead ball era that happens in the 1900s. How could that happen? Any suggestions? How do we go from an offensive extravaganza with a league batting average close to 300 to the dead ball era where nobody's hitting home runs anymore? Nobody's scoring runs. Two things happen. No. Number one, they started calling foul balls as strikes. Okay? I mean, who knows that a foul ball was not even a strike until 1901 in the National League? Nobody knows that. I didn't know that until like 5 years ago because it's just, it's just forgotten. And it shouldn't be forgotten. People should know that. And the other thing that happens, which really changes the way runs are scored and puts the game back in the pocket of the pitchers, is the spitball. Okay? A lot of the rules that had previously favored hitting were gradually drawn back by ownership. They changed the size of home plate. They created the foul strike, but it's the pitchers who came up with the invention of the spitball in about 1902 or 1903. Came upon that themselves. And that made a big difference in offense too. But that's really the subject of the second volume of the book, Big League Baseball History, Volume 2, 1894 to 1920, The Pitcher Strikes Back. But this is this book, and there it is, Big League Baseball History, only available at bigleaguebaseballhistory.com, not on Amazon, not in stores, only available from the website or buying it out of my hand. I did bring some books today, which are for sale. Normally a signed book goes for $40. Discount for those present today, $30. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you all next time.